The fever had claimed 3 years of Penelope Crawford's life, though she could barely remember what it felt like to wake without the bone-deep ache that had become her constant companion. She stood at the window of her boarding house room in Nevada, Missouri, watching the dust-covered street below with eyes that had forgotten how to see color in the world, her 22-year-old body feeling ancient beyond its years. The sickness had started with what the doctor called consumption, but then something else had taken root, something that left her weak and trembling, unable to keep down food, unable to sleep without nightmares, unable to remember what strength felt like in her limbs. Her parents were dead, her brother killed in a mining accident in Colorado 2 years prior, and the small inheritance that had brought her to this western Missouri town in 1883 was nearly gone, spent on doctors who could do nothing but shake their heads and prescribe tonics that made her sicker. Penelope pressed her forehead against the cool glass, feeling the October wind rattle the panes. She had been 20 when the illness began, full of plans to open a dress shop with the money her parents left her. Now she was a ghost in a boarding house, surviving on broth and bread when she could manage it, and the landlady, Mrs. Hutchins, was losing patience. The rent was due, and Penelope had nothing left to give. "Miss Crawford, you have a visitor, Mrs." Hutchins called from downstairs, her voice sharp with irritation. Penelope turned slowly, every movement requiring thought and effort. She had no friends in this town, no one who would call on her. Perhaps it was the doctor coming to tell her there was nothing more he could do, or perhaps the landlady had finally decided to have her removed. She smoothed her gray dress, noting how it hung on her frame like a curtain on a pole, and made her way down the stairs, gripping the railing to keep from swaying. In the small parlor stood a man she had never seen before, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of good whiskey. He held his hat in his hands and turned when he heard her footsteps, and something in his expression shifted when he saw her, a quick flash of concern before he schooled his features into politeness. "Miss Crawford, I am Xavier Zimmerman. I knew your brother Thomas in Colorado." The name sent a sharp pain through Penelope's chest. She had not heard anyone speak her brother's name in months. "Thomas," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. She gestured weakly to a chair. "Please sit down." Xavier waited until she had lowered herself carefully onto the settee before taking a seat across from her. He looked uncomfortable in the formal parlor, like a wild thing caged, and Penelope found herself studying him despite her exhaustion. He was young, perhaps 25 or 26, with calloused hands and the weathered skin of someone who spent his days outdoors. A cowboy, she thought, or a rancher. "I am sorry to come unannounced," Xavier said. "I only learned recently about Thomas's death. We worked the same claim for 6 months before the accident. He talked about you often, about his sister back east who was going to make something of herself out here." He paused, his eyes searching her face. "He would want me to check on you to make sure you were managing all right." Penelope felt tears prick her eyes, a rare sensation these days when she felt so hollowed out. "That is kind of you, Mr. Zimmerman, but as you can see, I am managing poorly." The words came out more bitter than she intended. "I have been ill for a long time, too long. I do not even remember what it feels like to be well." Xavier leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and regarded her with an intensity that made her want to look away. "What do the doctors say?" "They say many things, none of them helpful. Consumption, nervous exhaustion, female hysteria, weakness of constitution. They bleed me and give me medicines that make me worse. I have given up trying to understand it." She folded her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. "I apologize, Mr. Zimmerman, but I am not fit for company." I am not fit for much of anything anymore. Thomas told me you were the strongest person he knew, Xavier said quietly. He said when your parents died, you held the family together. You were only 16 and you made sure he and you survived. He said you could do anything you set your mind to. Penelope closed her eyes against the wave of grief and frustration. That was another person, another life. The sickness has taken everything from me. I do not believe that, Xavier said, and there was such certainty in his voice that Penelope opened her eyes to stare at him. I think it has hidden your strength, but it has not destroyed it. I think you have been fighting alone for so long that you have forgotten you do not have to. I have no one, Penelope said simply. And soon I will have nowhere. I cannot pay my rent, and Mrs. Hutchins is not a patient woman. Xavier was quiet for a long moment, turning his hat in his hands. Then he said, I have a ranch about 10 miles north of here. Nothing fancy, but it is mine, bought with what I saved working in Colorado and what I have made running cattle. The house needs work, and I am no kind of cook. I could use help, and you need a place to stay. More than that, you need fresh air and good food and to be away from this town that seems to be suffocating you. Penelope stared at him, certain she had misheard. You are offering me work. Mr. Zimmerman, I can barely stand for more than a few minutes at a time. I would be useless to you. You would not be working right away, Xavier said patiently. You would be recovering, getting your strength back. When you are well enough, if you want to help around the place, that would be appreciated, but it is not required. I owe Thomas a debt. He saved my life in that mine more than once. Let me do this for his sister. That is charity, Penelope said, hating how weak her voice sounded. I cannot accept charity. It is not charity. It is what your brother would have wanted. He made me promise before he died that if anything happened to him, I would look after you. I did not know where you were until a few weeks ago when I met a man from Kansas City who had known your father. He told me you had come to Nevada, Missouri. I have been searching for you ever since. Xavier set his hat on the chair beside him and met her eyes directly. Please, Miss Crawford, let me honor my promise to Thomas. Let me help you get well. Penelope felt something crack inside her, some wall she had built to keep the loneliness at bay. The thought of leaving this dreary boarding house, of breathing air that did not smell of boiled cabbage and despair, of having a purpose beyond simply surviving another day, was almost too much to hope for. But hope was dangerous. Hope could break what little remained of her. I do not know if I can get well, she whispered. I have been sick for so long, Mr. Zimmerman. What if this is all I am now? Xavier stood and crossed to her, kneeling so he was at her eye level. Up close, she could see the scars on his hands, the lines around his eyes from squinting in the sun, the sincerity in his expression. Then we will find out together. But I think you are more than this sickness. I think you have been drowning and you just need someone to pull you to shore. He held out his hand. Come with me, Penelope. Let me help you remember what it feels like to be well. She looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment, calloused and strong and steady. Then, slowly, she placed her trembling fingers in his palm and felt his hand close around hers with a gentleness that made her throat tighten. All right, she said. All right. The journey to Xavier's ranch took 2 hours in a wagon that had seen better days, and by the time they arrived, Penelope was gray with exhaustion, every jolt of the wheels sending fresh waves of pain through her body. Xavier noticed, his expression darkening with concern, and when he helped her down from the wagon, he did not let go until he was sure she was steady on her feet. The ranch house was small but well built, with a wide porch and windows that faced east to catch the morning sun. Around it stretched prairie land dotted with cattle, and in the distance, Penelope could see the dark line of trees that marked a creek. The air smelled of grass and earth and animals, so different from the stale closeness of the boarding house that Penelope felt dizzy with it. "The bedroom is through here," Xavier said, guiding her inside. The house was simply furnished but clean, with sturdy furniture and a stone fireplace that dominated one wall. He led her to a room off the main living area, where a large bed sat beneath a window overlooking the prairie. "This is yours. I will take the loft upstairs. There are blankets in the chest, and I will bring your things in from the wagon." Penelope sank onto the bed, the mattress surprisingly soft beneath her. Through the window, she could see the endless sky, blue and vast and unmarred by buildings or smoke. "It is beautiful here," she said softly. "It is," Xavier agreed. He moved to the fireplace in the bedroom and began building a fire, his movements efficient and practiced. "When I first saw this land, I knew it was where I was meant to be. After years underground in those mines, I needed space and sky and freedom. I needed to remember that the world was bigger than darkness and stone." "Is that what the mine was like?" Penelope asked, watching him work. Xavier nodded, not looking at her. "Like being buried alive every day. The only thing that kept me going was knowing I was saving money, building toward something better. Thomas used to say the same thing. He was working for you, saving every penny so he could help you start your dress shop." He finished with the fire and stood, brushing off his hands. "I am sorry he did not get to see you succeed." "I have not succeeded," Penelope said. "I have failed at everything I set out to do." Xavier turned to face her, his expression serious. "You have survived 3 years of illness with no one to help you and nothing to sustain you but your own will. That is not failure, Penelope. That is the fight of a lifetime, and you are still standing. That takes more strength than most people have." Penelope wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was wrong, that she was weak and broken and useless. But the fire was warm, and the bed was soft, and through the window, the prairie grass was bending in the wind like waves on an ocean she had never seen. For the first time in 3 years, she felt something other than despair. It was small and fragile and terrifying in its intensity, but it was there. It felt almost like hope. Xavier proved to be a man of his word. Over the following days, he asked nothing of Penelope except that she rest and eat the meals he prepared. He was no cook, as he had warned, but his food was simple and nourishing: venison stew and fresh bread and vegetables from a garden behind the house that was surprisingly well tended. He brought her meals on a tray and sat with her while she ate, talking about the ranch and the cattle and his plans for the future, never seeming bothered when she could only manage a few bites before her stomach rebelled. "It will take time," he said, when she apologized for wasting food. "Your body has forgotten how to do this. We will teach it again, slowly." The fresh air and quiet worked on Penelope like medicine the doctors had never been able to provide. She slept without nightmares for the first time in memory, waking to sunlight streaming through her window and the sound of Xavier moving around the house, starting the fire and making coffee. She began sitting on the porch in the afternoons, wrapped in blankets, watching him work with the horses or ride out to check on the cattle. There was a grace to him, a competence that came from years of hard work, and she found herself looking forward to his return, to the sound of his boots on the porch and his easy smile when he saw her waiting. "You have more color today," he said one evening, a week after she had arrived. He was unsaddling his horse, and Penelope had walked, slowly and carefully, from the porch to the barn to watch. It was the farthest she had gone since arriving, and her legs were shaking with the effort, but she refused to go back inside just yet. "I feel different," Penelope admitted. "Not well exactly, but less sick. Is that possible after only a week?" Xavier looked at her over the horse's back, his eyes warm. You were not just physically ill, Penelope. You were heartsick and lonely and without purpose. Those things drain you as surely as any disease. Here you have rest and food and company. Of course you feel different. You have been very kind to me, Penelope said. I do not know how I will ever repay you. There is nothing to repay. Helping you is not a burden. He finished with the horse and came around to where she stood, offering his arm. But I think you should head back to the house before you exhaust yourself. You are pushing too hard. Penelope took his arm, grateful for the support. The doctors always told me to rest, to stay in bed, to avoid exertion. But I think that made me weaker, not stronger. I think I need to push a little to remind my body what it can do. Then we will push, but carefully, Xavier said. They walked slowly back to the house, and Penelope was intensely aware of the warmth of his arm beneath her hand, the solid strength of him beside her. It had been so long since she had touched another person, since she had felt anything other than the impersonal hands of doctors and nurses. The simple human contact was almost overwhelming. That night, Xavier taught her to play cards, a simple game he had learned in the mining camps, and they sat by the fire trading stories about Thomas. Penelope told him about their childhood in Pennsylvania, about how Thomas had always been getting into trouble and how she had always been getting him out of it. Xavier told her about the mine, about the long, dark hours underground and the camaraderie among the men, about the day a tunnel had collapsed and Thomas had pulled him from the rubble, refusing to leave him even when the foreman had ordered everyone out. He saved 5 men that day, Xavier said quietly. 5 men who would have died if he had not been brave enough to go back in. He was a hero, Penelope. You should know that. Penelope felt tears sliding down her cheeks, the first real tears she had cried in months. I wish I could have told him goodbye. I wish I could have thanked him for everything he did for me. Xavier reached across the table and took her hand, his grip warm and firm. He knew, I promise you he knew. The days turned into weeks, and Penelope grew stronger. She began helping with small tasks around the house, washing dishes and folding laundry and preparing vegetables for the stew pot. Xavier protested at first, worried she was doing too much, but Penelope insisted. Having a purpose, having something to contribute, made her feel human again in a way that simply resting could not. She also began to notice things about Xavier that she had been too ill to see before. The way he always made sure the coffee pot was ready for her in the morning, even though he rose hours before she did. The way he brought her wildflowers from the prairie, setting them on the table without comment. The way he looked at her when he thought she was not paying attention, with something in his eyes that made her heart beat faster. Penelope told herself it was gratitude she felt, nothing more. Xavier had saved her when she had been drowning, given her a home when she had nowhere else to go. Of course, she felt drawn to him. But gratitude did not explain the way her breath caught when he smiled at her, or the way she found herself watching for him through the window, or the way she felt most alive when he was near. One afternoon in late November, nearly 2 months after she had arrived at the ranch, Penelope was in the garden harvesting the last of the winter squash when Xavier rode in with a stranger. The man was older, perhaps 50, with a weathered face and a badge pinned to his vest. Xavier dismounted quickly and came to where Penelope stood, his expression tight. "This is Marshal Hardin from Nevada," he said. "He needs to speak with you." Penelope felt her stomach drop. "What about?" The marshal touched his hat brim politely. "Miss Crawford, I am sorry to bother you, but there has been some trouble in town. Mrs. Hutchins, your former landlady, has accused you of stealing from her before you left. She says you took a silver tea service that belonged to her mother." Penelope stared at him, shock rendering her momentarily speechless. I did not steal anything from her. I left with only what was mine, the few clothes and personal items I had. She says different, the marshal said, not unkindly. She is demanding restitution or your arrest. I need to ask you to come back to town with me to sort this out. She is lying, Xavier said sharply. Penelope has been here the entire time, recovering from illness. She is not strong enough to travel to town and back in one day. I understand that, Mr. Zimmerman, but I have a job to do. If Miss Crawford is innocent, we will sort it out quickly enough. The marshal looked at Penelope. I give you my word I will see you are treated fairly. Penelope felt the familiar weakness creeping back into her limbs, the panic that came from being accused of something she had not done, from being powerless and alone. But then Xavier stepped closer to her, and she felt his hand on the small of her back, a steadying presence. I will come with you, he said. If Penelope has to go to town, I am going too, the marshal nodded. I expected no less. We can leave within the hour. The journey to Nevada was grueling, and by the time they arrived, Penelope was pale and trembling, holding tight to the wagon seat to keep from swaying. Xavier helped her down and kept his arm around her waist as they walked into the marshal's office, where Mrs. Hutchins was waiting with her lawyer, a thin man with small eyes and a pinched expression. There she is, Mrs. Hutchins said triumphantly when she saw Penelope. The thief who stole from me and ran off without paying her rent. I did not steal anything, Penelope said, her voice shaking but clear. I left because Mr. Zimmerman offered me a position at his ranch, and I had no money left to pay you. I am sorry for that, but I took nothing that was not mine. Then, where is my mother's tea service? It disappeared the same day you left, Mrs. Hutchins said. I do not know, but I did not take it. You can search my belongings if you wish. Everything I own is at Mr. Zimmerman's ranch. The marshal looked between the two women, clearly uncomfortable. Miss Crawford, did anyone see you pack up your things when you left the boarding house? I did, Xavier said. I helped her carry her trunk down to the wagon. She had only clothing and a few personal items. There was no tea service. You are her employer, the lawyer said smoothly. Of course you would lie for her. Xavier's expression went cold. I do not lie. If you are calling me a liar, we can settle that outside. Gentlemen, please, the marshal said, holding up his hands. Let us keep this civil. Miss Crawford, do you have any proof of your innocence? Penelope felt despair washing over her. How did one prove they had not done something? She had been alone at the boarding house, had packed her few possessions by herself before Xavier arrived. There was no one who could corroborate her story, no way to prove Mrs. Hutchins was lying. Marshal, may I speak? A new voice came from the doorway, and everyone turned to see a young woman standing there, plainly dressed with work-roughened hands. My name is Sarah Hayes. I clean rooms at Mrs. Hutchins's boarding house. What do you want, Sarah? Mrs. Hutchins said sharply. This does not concern you. Actually, it does, Sarah said, stepping into the office. She looked nervous but determined. I know what happened to that tea service, madam, and Miss Crawford did not take it. Your nephew did. I saw him carrying it out of the house the morning Miss Crawford left. He told me you had given it to him, but when I heard you were accusing Miss Crawford, I knew that was not true. Mrs. Hutchins went red, then white. That is a lie. My nephew would never steal from me. I am not lying, Sarah said firmly. I saw him, and so did Mr. Peters, who runs the livery. Your nephew took the tea service and sold it to buy whiskey. Everyone in town knows he has a drinking problem, madam. Everyone except you, apparently. The marshal looked at Mrs. Hutchins with new interest. Is this true? Of course it is not true, Mrs. Hutchins blustered. This girl is making up stories to protect her friend. Miss Crawford is not my friend, Sarah said. I barely knew her, but I will not let an innocent woman be accused of something she did not do. If you want, I can take you to the man who bought the tea service from your nephew. He runs the pawn shop on Main Street. The marshal nodded slowly. I think we will do just that. Mr. Jenkins, you and Mrs. Hutchins will come with me. Miss Crawford, you are free to go. I apologize for the trouble. Mrs. Hutchins looked like she wanted to argue, but her lawyer took her arm and steered her toward the door, both of them looking furious. When they were gone, Penelope sank into a chair, her legs no longer able to hold her. Thank you, she said to Sarah, her voice breaking. Thank you so much. Sarah smiled shyly. You always treated me kindly when you stayed at the boarding house, Miss Crawford. You were the only one who ever said good morning to me or asked how I was. I could not let Mrs. Hutchins do this to you. She glanced at Xavier, then back at Penelope. I am glad you are looking better. You look healthier than you did when you lived in town. I am healthier, Penelope said. Thanks to Mr. Zimmerman. Sarah nodded and said her goodbyes, slipping out of the office as quietly as she had arrived. Xavier helped Penelope to her feet and guided her back to the wagon, his expression dark. That woman is a menace, he muttered. Accusing you of theft when she knew her nephew had a problem. She was looking for someone to blame and you were an easy target. But it is over now, Penelope said. She felt shaky and exhausted, but also lighter than she had in months. The accusation had been disproven and she was free. More than that, people had stood up for her. Sarah had risked her employment to tell the truth, and Xavier had been ready to fight anyone who questioned Penelope's integrity. She was not as alone as she had thought. The journey back to the ranch seemed shorter, though Penelope dozed against Xavier's shoulder for much of it, too tired to care about propriety. When they arrived, he carried her into the house and settled her on the bed, pulling blankets over her despite her protests that she could manage. Rest, he said firmly. You have been through enough today. Xavier, she said, catching his hand before he could leave. Thank you for coming with me. Thank you for believing me. He looked down at their joined hands, then at her face, and something shifted in his expression, something raw and honest. I will always believe you, Penelope. I will always stand with you. You must know that by now. I am starting to, she whispered. He squeezed her hand gently, then left, closing the door softly behind him. Penelope lay in the darkness, her heart pounding, feeling more awake than she had in years. Winter settled over the prairie, bringing cold winds and occasional snow. Penelope continued to grow stronger, her body slowly remembering what health felt like. She could walk to the barn and back without stopping to rest. She could cook meals and clean the house, and even help Xavier with some of the lighter ranch work, feeding the chickens and gathering eggs and mending tack. The face that looked back at her from the mirror was different now, with color in her cheeks and light in her eyes, and sometimes she had trouble recognizing herself. Xavier watched her transformation with a mixture of pride and something deeper, something he tried to hide, but that Penelope could see in the way he looked at her when he thought she was not watching. They moved around each other carefully, both aware of the growing connection between them but neither willing to speak of it. Penelope told herself it was too soon, that she was still recovering, that Xavier had taken her in out of obligation to Thomas and nothing more. But at night, lying in her bed, she could not stop thinking about the way his hand felt in hers, the way his eyes softened when he smiled at her, the way her heart raced when he was near. Christmas came, and Xavier surprised her by bringing home a small pine tree and setting it up in the main room. Together, they decorated it with strings of popcorn and dried berries, and Xavier produced a small box wrapped in brown paper. For you, he said, handing it to her. It is not much, but I wanted you to have something. Penelope unwrapped the gift carefully, her hands trembling. Inside was a carved wooden bird, small enough to fit in her palm, with delicate wings and a long, curved beak. "It is beautiful," she breathed. "Did you make this?" Xavier nodded, looking embarrassed. "I used to carve in the mines during the breaks. It helped pass the time." "Thomas said you always loved birds, that you used to feed them in your garden back in Pennsylvania." Penelope felt tears prick her eyes. She had forgotten the simple joy of watching birds flit through the trees, the way their songs had made her feel connected to something larger than herself. I had forgotten." She looked up at him, clutching the carving to her chest. "Thank you, Xavier. This is the most thoughtful gift anyone has ever given me." "You have given me more," Xavier said quietly. "You have given me a reason to come home at the end of the day. You have made this house feel like a home instead of just a place to sleep. You have reminded me what it is like to have someone to care for, to worry about, to want to see happy." He took a step closer, his eyes searching her face. "Penelope, I need to tell you something, and I know I should probably wait, but I cannot hold it in any longer. I know you came here because of Thomas, because I owed him a debt, but that is not why you are still here. You are still here because I do not want you to leave, because I have fallen in love with you." Penelope's breath caught in her throat. "Xavier, you do not have to say anything," he continued, the words tumbling out now. "I know I am not what you planned for. I am just a cowboy with a small ranch and rough manners and a past full of hard work and harder choices. But I can promise you that I will spend every day trying to make you happy, trying to help you remember what it is like to be well and whole and alive. If you will have me, if you could ever come to feel the same way, I would count myself the luckiest man in the world." Penelope stood and closed the distance between them, taking his face in her hands. "You foolish man," she said, her voice choked with tears. "I am already in love with you. I think I started falling the first day you walked into that boarding house and saw me not as someone sick and broken, but as someone worth saving. You have given me back my life, Xavier. You have given me back myself. How could I not love you?" Xavier's arms came around her, pulling her close, and then he was kissing her, his lips warm and gentle against hers. Penelope melted into him, feeling safe and cherished and more alive than she had felt in 3 years. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard, and Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know it is fast, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. Marry me, Penelope. Let me spend the rest of my days making you happy." "Yes," Penelope said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, I will marry you." They were wed in the small church in Nevada on a bright January day, with Marshall Hardin and his wife standing as witnesses and half the town turning out to celebrate. Penelope wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had sewn herself, her first attempt at dressmaking in years, and Xavier wore a new suit that made him look uncomfortable but devastatingly handsome. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Xavier kissed her so thoroughly that several of the older ladies in attendance looked scandalized, but Penelope did not care. She was married to the man she loved, and she was healthy and whole and happier than she had ever imagined possible. The years that followed were not always easy, but they were good. The ranch prospered under Xavier's steady hand and Penelope's careful management of the household finances. They hired help when the work grew too much for just the two of them, a young cowhand named Jake and his wife Maria, who became fast friends with Penelope. The 4 of them worked the land together, building something that would last. Penelope's health continued to improve until the sickness was nothing but a distant memory, a shadow that had once loomed large but now was barely visible in the brightness of her new life. She opened a small dressmaking business from home, taking commissions from women in Nevada and the surrounding towns, and found joy in the creative work she had once thought lost to her forever. Xavier encouraged her every step of the way, building her a bright workroom off the kitchen where she could spread out her fabrics and patterns, where the light was always good and the space was entirely her own. 2 years after their wedding, Penelope discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with equal parts joy and terror. The doctors had warned her back when she had been sick that her body might not be strong enough for childbearing, that the sickness had taken too much from her. But Xavier held her close and told her that whatever happened, they would face it together, and Penelope chose to believe him. The pregnancy was difficult, with weeks of sickness in the beginning and aches and pains that left her bedridden toward the end. But through it all, Xavier was there, holding her hand and bringing her food and rubbing her swollen feet. When the pains began on a hot July night, he rode to town to fetch the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Douglas, who had delivered half the babies in Vernon County. The labor was long and hard, and there were moments when Penelope thought she might not survive it, when the pain was so great she could not imagine enduring another minute. But then she heard a baby crying, thin and outraged, and Mrs. Douglas was placing a squirming bundle in her arms, and Penelope looked down into the red, wrinkled face of her son and felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. "A boy," Xavier said, his voice thick with emotion. He was kneeling beside the bed, his eyes wet with tears. "Penelope, we have a son." "Thomas," Penelope said, stroking the baby's downy head. "We will call him Thomas after my brother." Xavier nodded, unable to speak, and bent to kiss both his wife and his child, overcome with gratitude and love. Little Thomas thrived, growing from a tiny infant into a sturdy, curious toddler who followed his father around the ranch like a shadow. 2 years later, a daughter arrived, easier this time, with Penelope's dark hair and Xavier's golden eyes. They named her Catherine, after Xavier's mother, and she was as fierce and independent as her brother was gentle and thoughtful. The house that had once seemed too large for just 2 people now rang with laughter and noise, with children running through the rooms and friends stopping by for meals and neighbors coming to trade news and gossip. Penelope sometimes stood on the porch, watching Xavier teach Thomas to ride or Catherine chasing the chickens, and marveled at how far she had come from that dark room in the boarding house where she had been slowly dying, forgotten and alone. She thought often of Thomas, her brother, and the promise he had extracted from Xavier in the darkness of the mine. He could not have known what that promise would mean, how it would save not just Penelope's life, but give her a future she had never dared to dream of. She liked to think he was watching over them, proud of what they had built, happy that his sister had found love and health and purpose. When Penelope was 30, she and Xavier took a trip to Colorado, traveling to the town where Thomas had died, where Xavier had worked those long years underground. They visited his grave, a simple marker in a windswept cemetery, and Penelope placed wildflowers on the stone and told her brother about his nephew and niece, about the ranch and the life she had made. Xavier stood beside her, his hand warm in hers, and when she was finished, he added his own thanks, his voice low and steady. "I kept my promise, Thomas. I took care of her just like you asked. And she took care of me, too, in ways I did not even know I needed. We are building something good here, something that will last. I hope you are proud. I hope you know how much your sacrifice meant." They stood there for a long time, the wind blowing across the prairie grass, the sun warm on their faces. Then Penelope took Xavier's hand and they walked back to the wagon, ready to return home to their children and their life. The years continued to unfold. each one bringing new challenges and new joys. Thomas grew into a young man who loved the land as much as his father did, who spent long days working cattle and mending fences and learning everything Xavier could teach him. Catherine was different, more drawn to books and learning, and when she was 16, Penelope and Xavier sent her to a teacher's college in Kansas City, proud and terrified in equal measure. She returned 2 years later with a degree and a fierce determination to open a school in Nevada, to give other children the education she had received. Jake and Maria's children grew up alongside Thomas and Catherine, and the two families became so intertwined it was sometimes hard to tell where one ended and the other began. They celebrated holidays together, helped each other through hard times, and built a community that felt like family in the truest sense. Penelope's dressmaking business continued to grow, and she eventually hired 2 young women from town to help with the increased demand. She taught them the skills her mother had taught her, the careful measuring and cutting and stitching that turned fabric into something beautiful and lasting. It gave her great satisfaction to pass on that knowledge, to help other women build skills that could support them. Xavier's ranch became one of the most successful in the county, known for the quality of its cattle and the fairness of its owner. He never forgot what it was like to work underground, to feel trapped and powerless, and he treated his employees with respect and paid them well. Men came from all over Missouri to work for Xavier Zimmerman, knowing they would be treated fairly and given opportunities to learn and grow. As they grew older, Xavier's hair turned silver at the temples and lines deepened around Penelope's eyes, but the love between them never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing year, tempered by the trials they had faced together and the life they had built. They still sat by the fire on winter evenings, trading stories and playing cards, and Xavier still brought Penelope wildflowers from the prairie, setting them on the table without comment. When Penelope was 45, she was sitting on the porch one autumn afternoon, watching the leaves turn gold in the trees by the creek, when Xavier came and sat beside her. He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers, and they sat in comfortable silence for a long time. "Do you remember," Xavier finally said, "that first day I came to the boarding house? How fragile you were, how sick?" Penelope smiled. "I remember thinking you must be mad, offering to take in a dying woman you did not even know." "I was not mad. I was desperate to keep my promise to Thomas. But I never expected this." He gestured to the ranch, to the house they had built, to the life they had made. "I never expected to fall in love. I never expected you to get well, to be strong, to become the woman you are now. You have exceeded every hope I had." "You saved my life," Penelope said simply. "I had been sick so long I forgot what health was. I forgot what it was like to have a reason to wake up in the morning, to have something to look forward to. You helped me remember all of that. You helped me remember what it was like to be well." Xavier raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "We saved each other, I think. I was lost too in my own way, working myself to death, living alone, not letting anyone in. You taught me how to live again, how to love, how to build something that matters." Penelope leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. "I love you, Xavier Zimmerman. I have loved you since the day you held out your hand and asked me to trust you. And I love you, Penelope Zimmerman. I will love you until my last breath and beyond." They sat together as the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. In the distance, they could hear Thomas calling the cattle, his voice strong and sure. Catherine was in the house, preparing dinner, and soon she would call them inside to eat. Friends and family would gather around the table, sharing food and stories and laughter, and the house would be full of warmth and life. Penelope thought back to that scared, sick woman who had stood at the boarding house window, watching the world go by and believing she had nothing left to live for. If she could go back, she would tell that woman not to give up, that help was coming, that love was coming, that a life beyond her wildest dreams was waiting just around the corner. She would tell her that sickness was not forever, that the body could heal, that the heart could mend. But she could not go back, so instead she squeezed Xavier's hand and smiled, grateful beyond measure for the journey that had brought her here, to this porch, to this man, to this beautiful, unexpected life. The years continued to pass with the gentle rhythm of the seasons, marking time with births and weddings and quiet moments of grace. Thomas married a woman named Alina from a neighboring ranch, and they settled on a piece of land Xavier deeded to them, building their own home and starting their own herd. Catherine married late, at 30, to a school teacher from Kansas City who had come to Nevada to help her with the school. They had twin daughters who were sharp as tacks and twice as trouble, and Penelope delighted in spoiling them the way grandmothers had done since the beginning of time. Xavier and Penelope grew old together, their bodies slowing but their spirits still strong. When Xavier's back began to ache from long days in the saddle, Penelope rubbed liniment into his muscles and told him stories to distract him from the pain. When Penelope's hands grew stiff with arthritis, making it hard to sew, Xavier built her special frames that held the fabric taut so she could still do the work she loved. They traveled some, taking the train to Denver and once, memorably, to San Francisco, where they saw the ocean for the first time and marveled at the endless blue horizon. But they always came home to the ranch, to the land they had worked and loved, to the community they had helped build. On their 30th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered for a celebration. Thomas and Alina brought their 4 children, ranging in age from 20 to 10. Catherine and her husband brought the twins, now 15 and full of opinions about everything. Jake and Maria, now retired but still living in a small house on the ranch property, came with their grown children and grandchildren. Friends from town and neighboring ranches filled the house and spilled out onto the porch and lawn, bringing food and gifts and well wishes. Penelope stood in the middle of the chaos, watching Xavier entertain a crowd with a story about a particularly stubborn bull, and felt a wave of emotion so strong it nearly knocked her over. This was her life. These people, this place, this love. It had all started with a sick woman in a boarding house and a cowboy keeping a promise to a dead friend, but it had become so much more than that. It had become a legacy. That night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet, Xavier and Penelope lay in bed together, exhausted but happy. Xavier's arm was around her shoulders and Penelope's head rested on his chest, listening to the steady thump of his heart. 30 years, Xavier murmured. I cannot believe it has been 30 years. It has gone so fast, Penelope said, and yet I cannot imagine my life without you. It feels like we have always been together. We have, in a way. From the moment I saw you in that boarding house, I think some part of me recognized you, knew you were meant to be mine. Xavier pressed a kiss to the top of her head. I am grateful every day that Thomas asked me to look after you. I am grateful for every moment we have had together. So am I, Penelope whispered. So am I. They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built a love that would endure beyond their lifetimes. When Penelope was 68, she fell ill again, not with the mysterious sickness that had plagued her youth but with pneumonia, brought on by a cold winter and a weakened immune system. The doctor came and prescribed bed rest and medicine, and Xavier sat beside her bed day and night, holding her hand and telling her stories, just as she had done for him when his back troubled him. "You are not allowed to leave me," he said one night, his voice rough with fear and exhaustion. "We had a deal, Penelope. You promised to stay with me until the end." Penelope squeezed his hand weakly, her breathing labored. "I am not going anywhere, you stubborn man. I have too much to live for. Our grandchildren need their grandmother to spoil them, and you need someone to keep you out of trouble." "I do," Xavier agreed, his eyes wet. "I absolutely do." Penelope fought the illness with the same determination she had shown all those years ago, and slowly, gradually, she recovered. Xavier had been right all those years ago when he told her she was strong, that the sickness had only hidden her strength, not destroyed it. That strength carried her through the pneumonia and back to health, back to the life she had built with Xavier. They celebrated Penelope's 70th birthday with a quiet dinner, just the two of them and Thomas and Catherine and their families. Xavier had carved her a new bird, a robin this time, with its chest painted a soft red. She added it to the collection on the mantel, a whole flock of wooden birds that Xavier had made for her over the years, each one a reminder of his love and thoughtfulness. "You remember the first bird you gave me?" Penelope asked that night as they sat by the fire. "On our first Christmas together." "I do," Xavier said. "You cried, and I thought I had done something wrong. I cried because it was the most thoughtful gift anyone had ever given me. Because you had listened to Thomas, had remembered something he said about me, and had taken the time to make something with your own hands." Penelope looked at the birds on the mantel, each one unique and beautiful. "These birds are my most treasured possessions. More than jewelry or fancy dresses or anything else, because each one represents a moment when you thought of me, when you wanted to make me smile." Xavier reached over and took her hand. "You have made me smile every day for over 40 years, Penelope. Making you a few birds is the least I could do." They sat together in the firelight, two old people who had loved each other through sickness and health, through hard times and good, through every season of their lives. The fire crackled and popped, and outside the winter wind howled across the prairie. But inside, all was warm and peaceful. Xavier Zimmerman died quietly in his sleep at the age of 81, with Penelope holding his hand. He had spent the day working with Thomas on a new barn, had eaten a hearty dinner with his family, and had gone to bed smiling, telling Penelope he was the luckiest man alive. When she woke in the morning, he was gone, his face peaceful, his hand still clasped in hers. Penelope grieved deeply, as one does when losing a partner of 50 years, a love that had sustained her through everything. But she did not break. She had been broken once, long ago, and Xavier had helped her heal. She would not dishonor his memory by falling apart now. Instead, she lived, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, continuing to sow and tell stories and pass on the wisdom she had gained over a long and well-lived life. She stayed on the ranch, in the house Xavier had built, tended by Thomas and Alina and visited frequently by Catherine and her family. She sat on the porch in the afternoons, watching the prairie grass bend in the wind, and sometimes she could almost feel Xavier beside her, his hand warm in hers, his voice soft in her ear. Penelope Crawford Zimmerman died peacefully at the age of 92, surrounded by her family, in the same bed where she had given birth to her children and slept beside her husband for 50 years. Her last words were to Thomas, who knelt beside her holding her hand. "Tell your father," she whispered, her voice faint but clear. "Tell him I kept my promise. I stayed until the end. Tell him I love him and I will see him soon." Thomas nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I will tell him, Mother, I promise." Penelope smiled, and then she was gone, her face relaxing into the peaceful expression of someone who had lived fully and loved deeply and left the world better than she found it. They buried her beside Xavier on a hill overlooking the ranch, under the wide Montana sky they had both loved. The whole county came to the funeral, paying their respects to a woman who had been a friend, a neighbor, a teacher, and a pillar of the community. The preacher spoke of her kindness and strength, of the way she had overcome illness and adversity to build a life of purpose and meaning. But it was Thomas who gave the eulogy that truly captured who his mother had been. "My mother was sick for 3 years before my father found her," he said, his voice carrying across the crowded cemetery. "She had forgotten what it was like to be well, to have hope, to believe in a future. My father, honoring a promise to my uncle, gave her those things back. But she did not just receive that gift. She multiplied it. She took the second chance she was given and built a life that touched hundreds of people. She taught, she sewed, she loved. She raised children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She proved that it is never too late, that no one is beyond hope, that love can heal even the deepest wounds. That is my mother's legacy. Not just that she survived, but that she thrived, and that she helped so many others do the same." As they lowered Penelope's casket into the ground beside Xavier's, a flock of birds rose from the trees by the creek, their wings catching the sunlight as they wheeled and turned in the bright blue sky. The mourners watched them go, and more than one person thought of the wooden birds on Penelope's mantle, the love made tangible, the promises kept. The ranch continued for generations, passed down through Thomas, and then his children and their children, each one adding to the legacy that Xavier and Penelope had started. The house was expanded and updated, but never torn down, and in the living room on the mantel above the fireplace sat a collection of carved wooden birds, carefully preserved and protected, a reminder of a love that had healed a broken woman and built something that would last forever. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind blew soft across the prairie, people swore they could see 2 figures on the porch, sitting close together, hands entwined, watching the sun set over the land they had loved. No one could ever say for certain if it was real or just a trick of the light, but it did not matter. What mattered was the story, the love, the legacy. What mattered was that Penelope Crawford had been sick so long she forgot what health was, and Xavier Zimmerman had helped her remember feeling well. And in doing so, they had both found something far greater than either of them had ever dreamed possible. They had found each other, and they had found home,